Now, with their roots in collective agriculture, states often had control over the essentials of daily life, effectively in Sumerian temple or palace workshops. We see this sort of thing happening in salt and iron or tea monopolies in imperial China as well. But it's not always true that a state has the essentials of what it needs to survive under its direct control. For instance, perhaps particular things that are needed are too far away. Perhaps they're under some other party's control. At the end of the day, states, when they need to acquire things that are too far removed, perhaps, often rely on trying to motivate relevant third-party actors to go out and acquire things for them. Now, one of the early examples we see of this is in 5th century BCE in the Athenian city-state. The Athenian city-state on the Peloponnesian Peninsula really didn't have sufficient agricultural land in order to support the population that grew up ultimately in Athens. A lot of the local agricultural land was used for things like olives or beekeeping to develop honey. But at the end of the day, the pure basic amount of wheat necessary to support the society couldn't be grown locally. And instead, the way that the population had grown to be so large was by actually creating legal incentives that would encourage individual entrepreneurs to go out to distant wheat locations and bring them back to the city of Athens. For instance, one of the requirements under Athenian law was that ships who wanted to sail into the Athenian port necessarily had to be able to bring in some kind of grain. So this sort of thing is particularly important. The Romans did a similar sort of tactic, being unable to feed their million-person metropolis with the simple amount of agricultural land they had in its immediate vicinity. Now, grain trading isn't the only kind of situation where we see the state leaning on private sectors to ultimately deliver things to them. We see the same sort of thing happening in early Athenian mining as well. It's worth noting that Athenian mining is nothing like modern-day mining. Athenian mining involves sending slaves into the pit to dig until they die, for the most part, which is a little bit different, you might say, than the kinds of professional mining that we engage in the 21st century. Nonetheless, even within the context of slave-driven mining in the Laurian mines just outside of Athens, what we see is that the state itself did not actually control the mining operation. The state controlled the land in which mining took place, but they actually auctioned off operating leases of varying qualities to people who were interested in pursuing entrepreneurial activities of sending their slaves into the pit to dig. Nonetheless, it goes to show that the state itself was not actually involved in this particular allocation directly. Instead, what it did is it tried to ensure that whoever was going to be managing these particular resources were doing so in an efficient way. So the idea of holding an auction was to try to ensure that the most productive people would end up being in charge of a particular kind of operation. Now, as everyone can imagine, there is this type of allocation or discretion among the state officials about who will get to operate certain kinds of resources can lead to significant corruption. So in Athens, they actually made sure that the people who were responsible for making these allocations had both short tenure and were required to publicly post the results of their auctions so that the members of the public could review it. So the idea being that transparency and frequent turnover would prevent the accumulation of power that might allow someone to use their discretion for private interests as opposed to a collective public interest. Now, as in classical Athens, modern states often try to influence economic outcomes by either incentivizing certain kinds of activities or by regulating certain kinds of private activities. We can either offer funds or reduce tax obligations, and in doing so, this tilts the private sector's risk-reward trade-off, hopefully, in favor of particular investment that we're hoping to generate. In the modern world, in the 21st century, we refer to these sorts of policies as industrial policy. This is often an important part of the national strategies of developing nations. Even the most ardent free traders like the United Kingdom and the United States of America engaged in industrial policy in the early stages of their own industrialization, mostly under the basis of infant industry arguments. This allowed for significant national champions to eventually emerge over the 19th century. And so it's a little disingenuous to hear free traders in the 21st century trying to discourage others from climbing the same sort of ladder that they did. Nonetheless, industrial policy has made a major comeback, particularly in the 21st century, as states are beginning to move away from a theme of broad globalization, where all kinds of activities can be sourced from all sorts of places, and are specifically trying to make sure that certain kinds of activities take place within areas that they control, largely for strategic purposes. But we see this in the United States, we see this in the European Union, we see this in China. A number of major economies are beginning to lean away from a globalization narrative and lean a little bit more heavily into ensuring that industrialization doesn't just grow randomly, but instead is a more of a cultivated garden, growing in the direction that the state hopes that it will. Now, regulations typically tend to show up in industries where we hope to reduce information asymmetries. It's things like in drug or food safety or electrical goods, or in construction work, in regulation of financial institutions, and frequently in places where it's hard for us to determine product quality before we engage in a purchase. Now, of course, regulation might seem like an obvious panacea. We will simply prevent people from doing bad things. But it's important to remember that all regulations impose costs on society as well. We need not only to monitor people's behavior, but we need to enforce good behavior as well. And these can impose significant burdens on society if it's not properly designed. Now, in terms of imposing burdens on society, one of the big problems governments can create for themselves is what we would call crony capitalism, simply providing inefficient firms or the wrong firms with the rights to engage in certain kinds of activities. This is usually a situation where politicians or those who have allocational authority are looking to shore up their authority to some extent by providing goods or benefits to certain parties that they hope they will later be able to rely on for political support. This sort of thing was broadly seen out in a number of countries over the centuries, quite frankly. A famous case from 1693 actually involved the exposure of the British East India Company, having set aside £90,000 a year specifically to bribe politicians in the British House of Commons to ensure that the East India Company was favorably treated by the law. Similarly, on the Atlantic, on the other side of the Atlantic, in Canada and the US in the 19th century, substantial land grants and tax subsidies were granted to industrialists who were developing railroads and canals. Fortunately, in both cases, the processes were heavily corrupted, with extraordinary grants being offered in exchange for bribes. In fact, Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, was taken down by exactly such a corruption scandal, known as the Pacific Scandal, where he had accepted substantial bribes in exchange for favoring certain parties related to the Canadian Pacific Railway. Now, broadly speaking, the major problem associated with crony capitalism and with governments picking winners is that it can raise barriers to entry for otherwise successful or efficient firms, and it can lead to politicians simply engaging in allocation in a way that fortifies their own power as opposed to enriching society. So we need to keep our eyes on this to ensure that the state is ultimately being operated in the interests of those who provide the resources, not simply the interests of the allocators.